My wife cheated while I was away, a betrayal I never saw coming. I didn't want to leave her, but I had no choice. My mother was sick, and I needed to be there. Rachel understood, or at least I thought she did. She had even helped me pack, offering reassuring words that everything would be fine while I was away. As I hugged her goodbye, I promised it wouldn't be for long, just a few weeks, maybe a month at most. I believed in her, in us. After all, we had been through tough times before, and we always pulled through together. The drive to my hometown felt longer than usual. My thoughts were scattered, worry for my mother, relief that I'd be able to help her, and a small tinge of guilt for leaving Rachel alone. But she was strong, I reminded myself. We both were. Once I arrived at my mother's house, the days quickly became consumed with caring for her. The hospital visits, the medication schedules, and the endless worrying took up all my energy. Rachel and I texted regularly, and I called her every evening to check in. She always sounded upbeat, telling me about her day, assuring me that she was doing fine on her own. She even joked about catching up on some shows I never had the time to watch with her. But then, something started to change. Her texts became shorter, her responses delayed. At first, I brushed it off as nothing, blaming it on my own stress. But soon, I began to sense a shift in her tone, a detachment that hadn't been there before. When I called, she was more distracted, always busy with something. There was an unfamiliar distance in her voice that I couldn't place. I tried not to let it bother me. After all, I had my hands full with my mother's health, and the last thing I needed was to start doubting Rachel. Still, that gnawing feeling of unease wouldn't go away. Something wasn't right. Then, one night, it happened. I was sitting by my mother's bedside when my phone buzzed with a message from a friend. It was a photo, Rachel, at a party. That alone wouldn't have been strange, except for the fact that she was with a man I didn't recognize. The way they stood close together, their body language, it didn't sit well with me. My stomach dropped. I knew I had to confront her, but I also knew that the timing wasn't right. I couldn't abandon my mother in her fragile state to chase shadows. So, I stayed. I stayed with my mother, caring for her, pretending everything was normal. But in the back of my mind, the doubts about Rachel began to grow. What was going on while I was away? Who was that man? And why hadn't she mentioned anything about him? The next few days passed in a blur, my mind a chaotic storm of worry and suspicion. I needed answers, but for now, I had to wait. I had to trust that whatever was happening, I'd find out soon enough. The longer I stayed away, the more distant Rachel became. Our nightly calls dwindled to short, almost obligatory check-ins, and her excuses for missing my calls began to pile up. Work was keeping her late, she said, or she was too tired after a long day. But something in her voice told me it was more than just exhaustion or busyness. It was something deeper. I tried to convince myself that I was overthinking things, that my time away was just straining our connection. But no matter how hard I tried to shake the feeling, it persisted. I confided in my best friend, Matt. He had known Rachel and me since we started dating and had always been someone I could count on for honest advice. "You think she's cheating?" he asked bluntly over the phone. His words hit me harder than I expected. I hadn't said it out loud yet, but that was exactly what I feared. "I don't know," I admitted, rubbing my temples. "I just feel like something's off. She's being weird, distant." Matt paused for a moment before responding, "Man, you need to talk to her. Straight up. Ask her what's going on." He was right. Avoiding the conversation wasn't going to help. I needed to face whatever was happening head-on. But I wasn't ready to confront her over the phone, not yet. I needed to be there, to see her face when I asked her. A few days later, my mother's condition stabilized, and I felt it was finally time for me to return home. The drive back was filled with a mixture of relief and dread. I wanted to believe that I was being paranoid, that everything was fine and I would walk through the door to find the same woman I had left behind. But the photo my friend had sent kept flashing in my mind. When I arrived home, something was different. The house felt cold, unfamiliar. I called out for Rachel, but there was no answer. Her car was in the driveway, but she wasn't anywhere to be found. After checking the usual places, I found her in the backyard, sitting by the pool, her phone in hand. She didn't look up when I approached. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "I'm home." She looked up, startled, like she hadn't expected me to be there. Her eyes flickered with something, guilt, perhaps, before she smiled weakly. "Oh, I didn't realize you'd be back so soon." I sat down next to her, feeling the tension between us like a thick wall. "Is everything okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She nodded, too quickly. "Yeah, of course. Why wouldn't it be?" But I couldn't hold it in any longer. "I saw a photo of you. With someone. At a party." Her face went pale as the words left my mouth. "Who was he?" Rachel's eyes darted away, and for a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer. Then, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "He's just a friend. It's nothing." But the way she said it, so dismissively, so rehearsed, set off every alarm in my head. "A friend?" I repeated, my voice tinged with disbelief. "Why didn't you tell me about him?" Her silence spoke volumes. I could see it in her eyes, there was more to the story, but she wasn't ready to tell me. I stood up, my hands clenched into fists. "Rachel, I've been away, taking care of my mother, and this is how you repay me? By lying?" She stood up too, her voice defensive. "I haven't lied about anything. I didn't mention him because it wasn't important." "Not important?" I shouted, my anger boiling over. "If it wasn't important, why do you look so guilty right now?" The silence between us was deafening. I stared at her, waiting for her to say something, anything that would make sense of this mess. But all she did was look away, avoiding my eyes. In that moment, I knew. I didn't need her to say it. The truth was already there, hanging between us like a dark cloud. Rachel had betrayed me. I couldn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, while Rachel slept soundly beside me, or at least pretended to. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the image of her with that man. The thought of her betraying me gnawed at my insides, making me sick. My mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Was it just once, or had this affair been happening for months while I cared for my sick mother? The next morning, I knew I couldn't go on like this. I had to know the truth. I couldn't keep tiptoeing around the issue, afraid of what I might find out. The uncertainty was killing me faster than the reality of her betrayal ever could. Over breakfast, the tension between us was unbearable. Rachel barely looked at me, pushing her food around on her plate. I set my coffee cup down, taking a deep breath before speaking. "Rachel, we need to talk." She looked up at me, her expression wary. "About what?" "You know what." I kept my voice calm, but firm. "I need to know the truth." She hesitated, her fork clattering against the plate as she set it down. "Jake." "Don't," I interrupted, shaking my head. "Don't sugarcoat it. Just tell me. How long has this been going on?" Rachel's eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I thought she might try to deny it again. But then she sighed, her shoulders slumping in defeat. "A few months." A cold wave of shock washed over me. Months. While I had been caring for my dying mother, she had been seeing someone else behind my back. My hands clenched into fists, the betrayal cutting deeper than I thought possible. "Why?" I asked, my voice hoarse. Rachel wiped at her eyes, sniffling. "I don't know. I was lonely, Jake. You were gone for so long, and I didn't know how to handle it. He was just there." My heart pounded in my chest, rage building with every word she said. "So, what? You just couldn't wait for me to come back? You couldn't be faithful for a few months while I took care of my mother?" "It's not like that," she whispered, shaking her head. "I didn't mean for this to happen." I stood up abruptly, pushing my chair back so hard it nearly fell over. "But it did happen, Rachel. You made a choice. While I was away, you decided that this other guy was more important than our marriage, than our life together." Tears streamed down her face, but I couldn't bring myself to care. "Not right now. I'm sorry," she cried, her voice cracking. "I never wanted to hurt you." "Well, you did," I shot back, my voice hard. "You didn't just hurt me, Rachel. You destroyed everything we had. Everything." I paced the kitchen, trying to wrap my head around it all. I had trusted her. I had believed in us, in our love, and now it was all unraveling. "Who is he?" I asked suddenly, stopping in my tracks. "Who's the guy?" Rachel hesitated, then whispered his name. It didn't matter. I didn't recognize it, but knowing who he was wouldn't change the betrayal. "I don't care who he is," I said, my voice low. "What matters is that you chose him. You chose him over me, over us. And I don't know if I can ever forgive you for that." Rachel sobbed harder, but I felt numb. I had heard enough. I grabbed my keys and jacket, desperate for air, for space to think. "I need to get out of here," I muttered. "Jake, please," Rachel started, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Don't. Just don't." Without another word, I walked out the door, slamming it behind me. I drove for hours. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house, in that life that now felt like a lie. My mind was racing, replaying every moment of our marriage, searching for signs I'd missed, for clues that things had been going wrong. How could I have been so blind? So trusting? The sun was setting when I finally pulled into the parking lot of a bar on the outskirts of town. It was the kind of place you went to forget, with dim lighting and a jukebox that hadn't played a new song in years. I wasn't much of a drinker, but tonight, I needed something to dull the pain. I sat at the bar, ordering a whiskey, and as the burn of the alcohol hit my throat, I wondered how things had gotten so out of control. How had I ended up here, in a bar, drowning the reality of my wife's betrayal? A few drinks in, the weight of everything started to hit me all at once. I stared down into the amber liquid, seeing reflections of my shattered life. My mother was gone, and now, I was losing Rachel too. Everything I had held onto, everything I had fought for, was slipping away. The thought of going home to that house, to face Rachel again, felt unbearable. As I sat there, the anger started to fade, replaced by a deep, crushing sadness. I didn't want to lose her. Despite everything, despite the lies and the betrayal, I loved her. I had always loved her. But could love alone fix this? Could it heal the gaping wound her affair had left in our marriage? The bartender gave me a sympathetic nod as he refilled my glass, probably sensing the storm brewing inside me. I wondered if he had heard similar stories before, if he had seen men like me, broken by the people they trusted the most. I thought about confronting the man Rachel had been seeing, but what good would that do? Beating him to a pulp wouldn't erase what had happened. It wouldn't take away the fact that Rachel had chosen him, had let him into our life, into our bed. The damage was already done. As the night wore on, the bar filled with more patrons, and I could hear snippets of conversations around me. Laughter, clinking glasses, people living their lives. It felt surreal, like I was watching the world go on without me, while I was stuck in this endless loop of pain and confusion. At some point, I realized I couldn't keep drinking. I needed to think, to figure out what I was going to do next. I paid my tab and stumbled out into the cool night air, my head spinning from the alcohol and the weight of my reality. I found myself walking, aimlessly, trying to clear my mind. My phone buzzed in my pocket, but I ignored it. I couldn't deal with Rachel's calls or texts right now. I couldn't face her. Not yet. Eventually, I found myself by the old park where Rachel and I used to go when we first started dating. Back then, everything had seemed so simple, so perfect. We were in love, planning our future together, believing that nothing could come between us. How naive we had been. I sat down on one of the swings, the cold metal chains creaking as I moved back and forth. In the darkness, with only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, I let myself feel the full weight of the heartbreak. Could I forgive her? Could we move past this? I didn't know. But one thing was clear, I couldn't go on like this. Something had to change. The days that followed were some of the hardest of my life. I avoided Rachel, spending most of my time either at work or driving aimlessly around town. I couldn't bear to be in the same house as her, to see the face of the woman I had loved for years, now a stranger I could no longer trust. She had tried to talk to me, to explain herself, but I wasn't ready to listen. Not yet. Every time she tried, the image of her with someone else would flash in my mind, like a wound being ripped open all over again. How could she expect me to forgive that? But even as the anger simmered, something else started to take root: exhaustion. I was tired. Tired of fighting, tired of the silence between us, tired of living in a constant state of pain. I knew I couldn't live like this forever. Sooner or later, I would have to make a choice, either find a way to forgive her or walk away for good. One evening, after days of internal struggle, I finally made up my mind. I couldn't drag this out any longer. It was time to confront Rachel and find out if there was anything left to salvage. When I got home, she was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of untouched tea in front of her. The house was eerily quiet, and the weight of what was coming hung in the air between us. I sat down across from her, feeling the tension coil tight in my chest. "I think we need to talk," I said, breaking the silence. Rachel looked up, her eyes red and puffy from crying. "I've been waiting for you to say that." For a long time, neither of us spoke. I could see the guilt in her eyes, the remorse she'd been trying to express, but I didn't know if it was enough. Could I forgive her? Could I trust her again? Those questions still lingered in my mind. "I don't understand why," I finally said. "Why him? Why do this to us?" She took a deep breath, her hands trembling as she gripped her teacup. "I don't have a good excuse, David. I've been trying to find one, but the truth is, I messed up. I was lonely, and when you were gone taking care of your mom, I don't know. I let myself fall into something I shouldn't have." Her words hit me hard, but there was a part of me that had already suspected it. The time I had spent away from home, the distance that had grown between us while I was caring for my mother, it had created a gap. A gap that someone else had filled. "I never wanted to hurt you," she continued, her voice breaking. "I don't know if you can ever forgive me, but I need you to know that I still love you. I want to fix this, David. I want to make things right." I looked at her, searching her face for any signs of deceit. But all I saw was the woman I had fallen in love with, broken and full of regret. It wasn't an excuse for what she'd done, but it made the situation even more painful. I still loved her, too. But love alone didn't feel like it was enough anymore. "I don't know if I can ever trust you again, Rachel," I said quietly. I want to believe you, but this has changed everything. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she reached out to grab my hand. Please, David. I know I don't deserve it, but I'm begging you to give us another chance. Her touch was familiar, comforting even, but I felt a distance between us that I didn't know if we could ever bridge. The betrayal was too deep, the wounds too fresh. I don't know if I can, I admitted, pulling my hand away. I need time to think. Maybe we both do. Rachel nodded, her face crumpling as she sobbed quietly. I stood up, my heart aching as I turned to leave the room. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I needed space. Space to figure out what I wanted, what I could live with, and what I couldn't. As I walked out of the house, the weight of the decision ahead felt overwhelming. I knew I had two choices: fight for our marriage or let it go. Both options terrified me. In the end, I realized that the road to forgiveness wasn't going to be easy. It would take time, patience, and an effort on both our parts to rebuild what had been broken. But as I stood outside, staring at the darkening sky, I couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, we could find our way back to each other. Days turned into weeks after that conversation with Rachel. I moved out temporarily, staying at a cheap motel on the outskirts of town. The quiet solitude gave me space to think, to replay everything in my mind over and over. I kept searching for answers, wondering if there was anything I could have done differently, any sign I had missed. But the truth was brutal: the love of my life had betrayed me, and no amount of self-reflection would change that. Rachel called a few times. Her voice was always soft, almost fragile. She didn't beg, didn't push, just asked how I was doing. I kept my answers short. I wasn't ready to have a real conversation yet. Every time her name popped up on my phone screen, my heart clenched with a mixture of anger, sadness, and something I couldn't quite describe. Maybe it was longing. But I had to be honest with myself. No matter how much I still cared for her, trust was the foundation of any relationship, and ours had been shattered. I could pretend to rebuild, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't be the same. Could we ever look at each other without remembering what happened? One night, after tossing and turning for hours in the lumpy motel bed, I decided to take a drive. The roads were empty, the darkened streets stretching out like a void in front of me. I found myself heading toward the old house, the one I grew up in, where my mom still lived. Something about the place always grounded me, brought me back to a simpler time when life felt less complicated. When I arrived, Mom was sitting in her worn-out armchair, her face lighting up as I walked through the door. She didn't pry, didn't ask questions. She just hugged me, and for the first time in a long while, I felt a little bit of peace. "You'll figure it out, son," she said softly, her eyes full of the wisdom that only age and experience could bring. I stayed there for hours, talking about everything but Rachel. We reminisced about my childhood, about Dad, and about the times when life was simpler. I needed that, more than I realized. Just a reminder that not everything in my life was falling apart. When I finally left, something had shifted inside me. It wasn't clarity, but more like an acceptance of the path I was on. I knew what I had to do. The next morning, I called Rachel. She answered on the second ring, her voice thick with sleep and sadness. "David," she whispered, as if she couldn't believe I had finally called. "We need to talk," I said, my tone steady. We agreed to meet at the house later that evening. As I drove there, I felt a strange sense of calm wash over me. Maybe it was the time apart, maybe it was the space I had to think, but I knew what I had to say. Rachel was waiting in the living room when I arrived, her face pale and drawn. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, and my heart ached seeing her like that. But I had to stay strong, for both of us. "David, she started, but I held up a hand. "Let me talk first," I said. She nodded, tears already forming in her eyes. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about what happened," I began, my voice calm but firm. "And I realized that no matter how much I want to fix things, I can't get past what you did. The trust is gone, and without that, we don't have anything to build on." Rachel let out a small sob, covering her mouth with her hand. "I know you're sorry, and I believe you when you say that," I continued. "But I don't think I can ever look at you the same way again. I'll always wonder. I'll always doubt. And that's no way to live." Her sobs grew louder, her shoulders shaking as she cried. I wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but I couldn't. Not anymore. "I think it's best if we go our separate ways," I said softly, the words hanging in the air like a final goodbye. Rachel didn't argue, didn't beg me to stay. She just nodded through her tears, her face a mask of heartbreak. I could tell she knew this was the end, too. There was no saving what we had. I walked out of the house that night, my heart heavy but my mind clear. The marriage was over, and it was time for both of us to move on. As I drove away, I felt a strange mix of relief and grief wash over me. The pain was still there, but it wasn't as sharp anymore. It was something I could live with, something I could heal from. The road ahead was uncertain, but at least it was mine to walk. The days after I left Rachel felt like I was wading through fog, hazy, slow, and uncertain. I had made the decision to end our marriage, but it didn't erase the memories, the shared moments, or the love I once felt for her. Even though trust was broken, I couldn't just shut off the years we spent together. There were nights when the silence in my empty apartment became unbearable, and I caught myself wondering if I had made the right choice. But every time that doubt crept in, I reminded myself of that night, the night I came back to find everything I thought was stable and secure shattered by her betrayal. I wasn't angry anymore, though. Strangely, the anger had subsided, replaced by something softer, a kind of quiet sadness. One day, a few weeks after we had gone our separate ways, I found myself walking through the park where Rachel and I used to go on weekends. The air was crisp, with the first signs of fall beginning to show in the orange-tinted leaves. It was a place of good memories, and for the first time in a long while, I allowed myself to smile at those instead of focusing on the pain. Life moves on, whether you're ready for it or not. I still wasn't sure where I was headed, but I knew one thing: I was moving forward, little by little. Rachel and I hadn't spoken since that night. She sent a few messages, mostly about paperwork and the practical details of ending a marriage. I kept it cordial, simple, and distant. The person who used to be my whole world now felt like a stranger. A few days later, while sorting through some old boxes in my new place, I came across our wedding album. My heart tensed as I flipped through the pages. We looked so happy, so full of hope for the future. It felt like a different lifetime. Part of me wanted to throw the album away, to burn it, to rid myself of any reminder of what we once had. But I didn't. Instead, I closed it and placed it back in the box. Those memories were still part of me, even if they were tainted now. I didn't need to erase them to move forward. I was finally starting to accept that healing wasn't about forgetting. It was about learning to live with the scars. One afternoon, I received a message from Rachel. It wasn't like the others. This time, she wasn't talking about the divorce or asking about logistics. It was a simple message: "I'm sorry, truly. I hope one day you'll be happy again." I stared at the words for a long time. It was the first time since our separation that I didn't feel a stab of pain reading her name. I didn't reply, but I appreciated her message. Maybe, just maybe, we'd both find our way to something better, something that didn't involve the bitterness of the past. Weeks turned into months, and the emptiness that had once consumed me started to fade. I threw myself into work, reconnected with old friends, and even started picking up new hobbies. Life wasn't perfect, but it was mine again. Slowly, the pieces of myself that I thought were broken forever began to come back together. One day, as I was sitting on my balcony, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized something profound. Rachel's betrayal had changed me, but it didn't define me. The end of our marriage wasn't the end of my story, just the closing of one chapter. I was finally ready to start a new one.